Now let's move on to the creation of those beautiful category distribution charts. And here we're going to create the chart and chart area for the income type first, and then use that as a blueprint for the expenses and savings type. On this dashboard sheet, we start outlining the chart area that we want to cover 6 columns and 12 rows. For the outline, we're going to open the advanced border options, select this midlight gray as the border color, and then add a border at the top, bottom, left and right of the selected area. In addition, that chart area also needs a title, for which we're going to insert a text box and then type in income categories and in brackets tracked, as these distribution charts will be focused on the tracked data only. Let's format the text field by setting the font style to bold, then right-click on the text box and open the format shape settings to remove both the fill and the line around that box. Then we make it a bit smaller and highlight the income part of that title to make it stand out through a different font color, like this beautiful green. Eventually, let's position the text box within that area somewhere in the top left with some distance to both those borderlines. And then close the settings area on the right and focus on the creation of the actual chart itself. And for that, we jump over to the calculations sheet. Make sure that we leave a little bit of space for the calculations that we're going to put in here later for the dashboard KPI tiles. So down here in row 32, we're going to create a section bar for these chart calculations by adding a gray top and bottom borderline. And then noting down that this section will contain the chart calculations for the category distribution charts. Let's add a little bit of formatting by changing the font color and making that first part bold. And with one empty row between, we can then start building up the chart data. To create a dynamic data foundation for such a circular category distribution chart, we need to define 3 columns. As we want to display the tracked categories sorted from highest to lowest amount, the first column will contain the rank numbers within their type. In this case, the type is income. Then the second column will contain the respective category names, and the third column will contain the amounts tracked for these categories. Let's adjust the size of that amount column and then quickly format these column headers by setting the font style to bold and adding a simple bottom border. Since we want to display a maximum of 6 positions in the chart, with the last position being a collective position that covers all the categories that haven't made it into the top 5, we're gonna add in rank numbers from 1 to 6 in that first column. And then with this last row selected, open the advanced border options and add a double-lined border at the bottom to separate the chart data from the totals calculation, and a dotted line at the top to separate this collective position from the single categories that are ranked top 5. Below that doubled line, we then add the label total and make both these cells text style bold. Also, let's select this whole section and set the text alignment to center. And that is it for this general formatting. Perfect. For the initial chart setup, we're gonna work with dummy data, as this will allow us to ensure that every data point will be displayed in the chart with a big enough size and thus can be formatted adequately. As dummy data for the category labels, we insert income 1 to 5, and for the last one, other And for the amounts, we add the same amount of 1000 for each position so that every data point will be displayed in the chart with a big enough size. For the total amount, we then simply add 6000 for now, and eventually set the number format for those values to accounting with 0 decimal places. Great! As the data foundation for the expenses and savings chart requires a similar setup, let's quickly copy this over here with one empty column in between. Then we're gonna copy those 3 columns, but only to apply the same column sizes through choosing the Paste Special option and then selecting column widths. The only values that we're gonna change here are this first column header to expenses and the category dummy labels, which we can replace all at once by selecting them, then using the keyboard shortcut Ctrl-H and then entering income as the value to find and expense as the value to replace it with. Click Replace All. Perfect. And one last thing that we're gonna change is one of these dummy amounts to another number. This serves as a simple validation measure for us so that later we can automatically differentiate by the numbers which range of amounts we have currently referenced. And consequently, let's also adjust the total amount. Finally, let's copy over that expenses chart data section in order to also set up the data foundation for the savings chart. Again, we copy those columns to then paste special the column sizes, then just like before, replace the first column header with savings now, then change the dummy category labels to now contain saving instead of expense, and as the last step, change one of these 6 amounts and the total amount to make that set of amounts uniquely differentiable when we reference it. With these data sections set up, let's create the first chart for the income section. For that, we select the category and amount values of those 6 positions, then go to the Insert tab, and right there we select the donor chart type. When hovering over the single data points, we see that the first data point starts at 12 o'clock, and all the subsequent data points then just follow in a clockwise direction. Let's remove all the other chart elements and also format the chart area to have no fill and no borderline. And then we're gonna color these individual elements in different shades of green for these income categories. For the first and highest ranked category, we're gonna choose the dark shade of that green like this. And then for all the subsequent data points, we gradually assign lighter shades of green, so this one for the second ranked category, then this mid-light green, the even lighter green, and for rank 5, the lightest green that we have in that color palette. And for the last position, which is the collective position named Other, we're gonna choose a light gray tone to visually differentiate it from all these single positions. And that's it for the design of that chart, so now we can take it and move it over to the dashboard worksheet by cutting and pasting it. In here, our first task is to make it fit in there by sizing it down and positioning it approximately where we want to have it in the end. However, we're probably gonna slightly readjust that position once we have also added the dynamic chart legend to this section. As preparation for this dynamic chart legend, we now need to adjust the column sizes for these 6 columns covering this chart section. To make sure that the title and chart elements are not moved or resized when we change the sizes of the underlying columns, let's select both, then right-click and click on Format Object to open the settings area on the right. And here we go to the Size and Properties tab in order to set the properties to, this time, Move but don't size with cells. The reason we leave that move option activated is because once we have set up this income chart section, we want to duplicate and move it down with all its elements to set up the expenses and savings chart sections using the exact same design. Okay, for the column sizes, let's start with the separator column and make it a tiny bit wider. Then we select the first two columns that are covered by the category distribution chart and increase their size. While for the third column, we're gonna need to drastically reduce the size, as this column will contain the colors in the legend. Then the subsequent column will be used to display the respective category labels. For that reason, let's increase the size to make the majority of the labels fit in here. And eventually, the column right next to it will contain the tracked amounts assigned to each category, and for that purpose, the column size is almost perfect and only needs a slight adjustment. The last column will not contain any content and will serve as padding to keep enough space between the content and the right border. And then column AL will be used as separator column between this and the following chart section, and thus only requires little space. Great! For a uniform appearance for all these chart sections, we're gonna copy those 6 columns and then over here, right-click and paste special the column widths only. Once that is done, we can start building up the dynamic chart legend. And as already mentioned before, this tight column right here will contain the colors, this wider column will contain the category labels, and then this third column will contain the respective tracked amounts. And the good news are we have both the labels and the corresponding amounts already set up in the calculation sheet, so we can just reference the first category label cell as a relative reference with no $signs, because this will allow us to add the references to all the other labels and amounts by using this autofill handle. With all these cells selected, let's reduce their font size to 9. And then for the category labels, we're gonna add a little indent to create some spacing between the labels and the colors that we're gonna add on the left in a second. Then for the tracked amounts, we set the number format to the usual accounting format with 0 decimal places. And finally, to make that total row stand out, we set the font style to bold and also add a dotted upper borderline. That looks pretty good. So let's continue with the legend colors in these cells that will correspond to the colors that we have used in the donut chart. As we only want to display a legend color for those positions that are visible in the chart, so for those categories with a tracked amount greater than 0, we're not gonna directly set the fill of that cell, but instead make it conditionally based on if the category label right next to it is empty or not. Because later when we replace those dummy values with actual calculations, only the categories with a tracked amount greater than 0 will be displayed as non-empty cells here. So with this first color cell selected, we're gonna create a new conditional formatting rule that will only be applied in case the category label right next to it is non-empty. Please make sure that the cell reference here is a relative cell reference with no $signs. If that category label cell is not empty, we then want the fill color for this first legend position to be the same color that we have used for this first ranked category in the donut chart, which was this darker green. And there it is. Just to show you, if we had no income category with a tracked amount greater than 0, then even this first position would be empty, and in that case the corresponding legend color would disappear. To generate the conditional formatting rules for the other 5 rows, we can now select those 6 cells, then open the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager and duplicate this initial rule 5 times. After this, we have 6 rules that currently all apply to this first cell that has the address AH16. To now make the second rule apply to the second cell in row 17, in order to display the color of the second data point, let's adjust the row number for this applies to value. And since we have defined that cell reference in the rule itself as a relative reference, this will automatically adjust to now also reference row 17 once we open it. So there is nothing to adjust in that formula, and we can directly jump into the format settings to change the fill color to this shade of green that we have used for the second data point in the donut chart. Perfect. We can then repeat that process for the other 4 rules, setting the row number to 18, opening the formatting rule window to set the color to this mid-light green, and then pressing the apply button. For the 4th position, the relevant row is 19, and the corresponding fill color is this even lighter green. Then row 20 with this super light green, and finally row 21 that relates to this collective position named Other. And for that reason we'll have this light gray as the corresponding fill color. Once we apply all these defined rules, all the legend colors are now available and look super clean. To give you a little preview on how it would look with the actual income categories in here, as we only have 3 defined categories with tracked amounts, there would only be 3 positions with non-empty category label cells, and thus only the first 3 legend colors would be displayed. Great! Now with this dynamic chart legend set up, let's readjust the position of the donut chart to align it with the top edge of the legend. And then we can move it horizontally until we find a position we like. As I mentioned before, this initial setup of the income category distribution chart section will serve as the blueprint for the other 2 chart sections for expenses and savings. So to create the expenses category distribution chart section, let's select this whole range and copy it down here with 1 separator row in between. As you see, the references got a bit messed up, but we're gonna fix that in a second. First we start by adjusting the title to now contain expenses in a red font color. Next we're gonna change the references for both the chart and the legend area to the expenses data table in the calculation sheet. But one thing I recommend to do before you change the underlying data reference of any chart is to open your general Excel options. Then in the Advanced tab, scroll down to the Chart section, and in there you will find this option called Properties Follow Chart Data Point for Current Workbook. And this checkbox needs to be unchecked, so deactivate it, as with this option activated, Excel resets the complete formatting of a chart whenever it is connected to a new data source. With that being said, let's change the underlying data for this chart to no longer reference these income positions, but these expense positions instead. Since we have slightly mutated the amounts with the other position being set to 2000, we can instantly verify in our chart that the connection to the new data source was a success. And similarly, we're gonna update the initial cell in this legend area to now refer to this first ranked expenses category label as a relative reference. So we can use the autofill handle again to update all the cell references for the category labels and amounts. To restore the original formatting, let's just select the respective range in the income chart section, activate the Format Painter tool, and apply it to this section down here. Amazing! Now the only thing left to do is changing the chart and legend colors to the usual red color palette for expenses. For the chart, that means clicking onto every single element and changing the fill color to the corresponding red shade. So this darker red for the first data point, this main red tone for the second data point, then this mid-light red, the even lighter red, and the super light red for the last individual category. And we're gonna leave this light gray for the other position just as is. Then for these legend color cells, we select all 6 cells and open the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager. Since the cell references in the Applies To field and the formula itself have been automatically adjusted correctly, all we need to update is the fill color for those first 5 rules to their respective red counterpart. So for this first rule again, this darker red, which once applied is instantly visible in the worksheet. Then this main red tone for the second rule, this mid-light red for the next rule, then this even lighter red, and finally this lightest of those red tones for the fifth rule. Just like we did for the chart, we're gonna leave this light gray color in the last rule as is. And that's it for this expenses category distribution chart section. Now we're gonna repeat that whole process one more time for the savings category distribution chart, starting with the copy and pasting of the expenses section right over here, then adjusting the title to now contain savings with a blue font color, then updating the references for the chart and legend area. So for the chart area, we're gonna change the reference to these savings positions, for which we again can verify the correct update of the data source through this mutated amount of 3000, which as you see is now correctly represented in the chart. And for the dynamic chart legend, we only need to update this initial cell reference for the first rank category, and then can just autofill all the other values and copy over the formatting from one of the other sections. Eventually, we update the chart color palette to these blue tones, going from a darker blue to this super light blue, with the light gray of the last data point staying as is. And similarly, for the legend colors, we select all 6 of these cells, open the Conditional Formatting Rules Manager, and since those cell references all have been automatically adjusted again, we only need to update the individual fill colors of those rules to their blue counterparts. What a beautiful result! Now that we have set up all three of these sections, you might want to re-evaluate and adjust the position of all these donut charts within their respective section. And if that's the case, you can just select all three of them and use your arrow keys to apply uniform positional adjustments. While these dummy data were perfect for setting up the design and formatting of these charts and the dynamic chart legends, we should now move on to replace them with actual data. So let's jump over to the calculations sheet, select all dummy data in every data table, and delete it. Then we're going to start by setting up the formula for the amounts first. As the amounts that we want to bring in here are those tracked in the currently selected period, it makes sense to select a period in the dashboard that has tracked amounts available for all three sections. So let's change the selected period to February, for example. And as we want to display the categories in the same sorted order that we have already applied in the breakdown section, we can leverage synergies by making use of the already existing pre-calculations in those hidden columns. As a lookup column, we're going to need the sorted row ID column again, and we can hide all these intermediate calculations this column is built on. And to bring in the tracked amounts in the correct order, this time we will not make use of the row ID as the lookup value, but instead build the lookup value based on values that we have available in the data table in the calculation sheet. One number that we have available across all worksheets is the header row number of the respective section, which is also referenced here and has the value 9 for the income section. And this number, added together with the ranks from 1 to 5 that we have defined in the data table in the calculation sheet, will produce us lookup values that allow us to look up the corresponding row in this lookup column and then return the tracked amount from that row. So for example, 9 plus 1 looked up in here will return that row, from which we then return the tracked amount. Then 9 plus 2 looked up in here will return the row of the second highest tracked amount, and so on. So let's jump over and build this index match lookup. We start with the index function, for which we need to select the return array as the first argument. Since this formula is for the tracked amounts, we jump over to the budget dashboard and select column K that contains all those tracked amounts as an absolute reference with $signs. To figure out the row from which we want to return the tracked value, we insert a match function, for which we then construct the lookup value as the income header row plus whatever rank is specified for that respective position in the data table. So for this first position here, for example, the composed lookup value is 9 plus 1, so 10, and then by looking up that value in the sorted row ID lookup column with the letter X as an exact match, we will get the value from the respective row returned. And when we autofill that formula to all the 5 category positions, you see that we get a value for the first 3 positions, while the last 2 produce an NA error, as we only have 3 income categories defined. To avoid that error in case the number of defined categories is smaller than the rank number in that first column, let's extend that formula by putting the main statement into an if function. And that if function makes sure that in case that rank number is greater than the number of elements in the table that has the name income, then we avoid that NA error by simply returning an empty text string. And only if that is not the case, we then return the main formula. Great, so that solves this issue. Now there is one additional requirement that we want a category to fulfill in order to become visible in this dynamic chart legend. And that is that the tracked value for that category has to be greater than 0. Because with the current setup, a category would still be displayed in this chart legend even though nothing has been tracked for that category at all. So to exclude those 0 value categories as well, let's add another if statement inside here that first checks if that return value from the index match formula equals 0, in which case we also want to return an empty text string, and only if that is not the case, we're going to return the actual returned value. With that, we have completed the formula for returning the greatest 5 track category amounts. And then for cases where we have more than 5 categories defined, the tracked amounts for any category that didn't make it into the top 5 is then collected in this last position. Instead of directly calculating that collective position with a complex formula, let's make life easy and retrieve the total value first, because that value is already available in the pre-calculations of our dashboard worksheet and can be identified by looking up the income total row in this lookup column. And just to remember, the income total row name reference is nothing more but a name reference that returns the row number of that total item here in this initial budget planning sheet. So we can basically use the same index match lookup statement that we have used for the top 5 category amounts and just replace the lookup value with this income total row in order to get the total tracked value for all the income categories. And that works perfectly. Having both the total amount and the amounts of the top 5 categories available in here, we can now easily calculate the amount of all the other categories by taking this total amount and subtracting the sum of those top 5 amounts. So that value minus the sum of those 5. Now, since we have only 3 income categories defined, that other amount is obviously 0. But when we're going to transfer these calculations to the expenses section later, you will see that the other amount position will come into effect. In cases like here, with this position equaling 0, we also want to hide it by returning an empty string instead. And only in case it is not a 0, we want to return the actual amount. That is everything we need for these amount values, and now we also want to display the corresponding category labels for these top 5 and then also the label Other for the collective position. For retrieving the correct category labels that correspond to these highest tracked amounts, we can use the same index match statement as in the amount formula. The only thing we need to adjust is the column in the dashboard worksheet from which we're going to return the value. And as you see, that perfectly returns the corresponding category labels for that displayed amount. The great thing is, for this category column, we don't need to implement the logical structure for when to display or hide a value, as we can just take a look at the corresponding amount value, and in case that one is empty, we simply return an empty string for the category label as well. And only if a tracked amount is returned in that column, we know, okay, so obviously we have a category defined for that rank, and the tracked amount has to be greater than 0, so we can return the respective category label using that index match statement without any worries. Let's add this formula to all the top 5 positions, and for the last collective position down here, we're gonna apply the same check if that collective amount is an empty string, in which case we're also gonna return an empty string, and only if that amount cell is not empty, we're gonna display the label Other. Amazing! That was the whole process for linking this underlying chart data table to the actual tracked data. And now we can just copy those 7 rows to apply the same formula logic to the expenses chart table. As you see, those relative cell references inside this worksheet have been perfectly transferred, and now reference the correct cells in this expenses data table. The only adjustments we need to implement are first in the amount formula, replacing this reference to the income table with the expenses table, and changing both these name references to expenses header row, then in the category formula, also changing this name reference to expenses header row. And finally, after adding that updated formula to the top 5 rows, we take a look at the total amount formula, for which we also, in order to calculate the correct value for this collective position, gonna change this name reference to expenses total row. That looks pretty good. Let's just take a look at the breakdown section in the dashboard to validate if those top 5 category labels and the amount for all the remaining categories of currently 460 are legit. And as you see, those top 5 positions are exactly the same as listed in this breakdown, and the tracked amount for all the remaining categories sums up to 460. Perfect. That means the dynamic data retrieval into this chart data table works perfectly fine, and we can continue copying these formulas over to the savings chart data table. Here, of course, we're going to implement the same adjustments, first in the amount formula, updating this table reference to savings, and those two name references to savings header row, then in the category formula, also changing this name reference to savings header row, and finally, after adding this updated formula to the top 5 rows, we adjust the total amount formula to now look up the savings total row for retrieving the savings total tracked amount. With this updated total value, this collective position here has now correctly vanished, and let's quickly validate if those saving amounts match what we can find in the breakdown section. And that looks great. Seems like everything in those chart data tables is now working perfectly fine. So we can hide those pre-calculation columns again and take a look at the final state of those category distribution charts. These charts now perfectly visualize the actual tracked data for the selected year and period. So when we change the selected period to January, the charts update correctly. And the same for March. In that case of March, we have nothing tracked for the savings, so this chart area down there is empty as expected. And when we select total year, we get the most representative visualization of the category distributions, as the monthly deviations are getting more balanced out. Beautiful. We have come a long way to create the current state of this interactive budget dashboard, which is already super powerful and exciting. But let me tell you, this final chart that we're gonna build next to display the tracked versus budget amounts over time is probably one of the coolest and most flexible Excel charts I have built so far. So let's get straight into it. For this chart, we start by creating a similar chart section that is separated from its surroundings through some mid-gray borderlines. At the top, bottom, left, and right. And of course, we also need a chart section title, so let's just copy over this text box and replace the current text with tracked versus budget. And the budget part in brackets, as we want to be able to completely hide the budget values with one click in this chart. Now, to bring this title into the exact same relative position as the other titles within their sections, let's position this text box a bit lower than this text box and a bit further to the right when compared to this text box. Because that allows us to at first select both these, then go to the Shape Format tab and click on the Align Top option. With multiple elements selected, this will align all the elements to the vertical position of the highest positioned element. And then we select these two and click on the Align Left option in order to align the new title text box to the horizontal position of the savings chart title. That way, this new text box is now placed at the exact same relative position within its section as the other titles. And with that initial chart section set up, let's jump over to the Calculations worksheet and start building the Chart Calculations section for this final Tracked versus Budget chart. Just like for the other chart calculations, we create a similar header with the title Chart Calculations Tracked versus Budget Chart. And below that section header, we leave some space of 6 empty rows that we're gonna need for setting up the interactive checkboxes later. And then in row 54, we start creating the header row of the chart data table. Let's change the text style for this row to bold and centered. And then we're gonna define a lot of column headers which will explain themselves during the chart data setup. The first column is called Month. The second column, Type. Then we have another column for the month number. Then some binary columns for if the data row is in focus, if the type of the data row is visible or hidden, and if the remaining budget in that data row is visible or hidden. Then of course we need to bring in the tracked amount and budget value and calculate the delta between them. Let's scroll a bit up to optimize some of these column sizes. And all the columns that we have defined so far are basically the input columns for the actual data columns of the chart area. Those actual data columns will be 3 data columns for the selected periods that we want to put into focus, and those columns are named In Budget, Remaining, and Excess. And then we're gonna have the same 3 data columns for those periods that are not in focus. Let's transfer over the column sizes. Rename this header to Periods Not in Focus, and change the fill color to gray. To visually separate this header from the data, let's eventually add a simple bottom border here. And in addition, since we're only gonna need those 2 and the chart data columns for the initial chart setup with some dummy data, let's temporarily hide those in between input columns before we start working on the data. Since we want to have the data displayed for every month of the selected year, let's start by creating the first month as a full date using the date formula, for which we pass the selected year as year, then 1 for January as the month, and 1 as the day. For each month, we're gonna need 4 rows, of which the first 3 rows will be for the income, expenses, and savings data bar. And the row number 4 will be an empty row that will serve as a visual separator in our chart. So let's merge those 4 cells together in order to display the month for all 4 rows at once. Align it to the middle, and eventually format this full date to only display the first 3 letters of this month's name. Then, as already indicated, we're gonna add income, expenses, and savings to specify the type of each row, and then we leave the last row empty. To separate the data for each month from each other, let's also add a bottom border below these first 4 rows, and also let's set the general text alignment to center. For setting up the actual chart, we again want to make sure that each element is visible in the chart with a big enough size, so that we can format it adequately. And for that reason, we set each cell in those 6 columns and 3 rows to the same value of 1000, for example. Let's change the number format to our usual accounting format with 0 decimal places. And after that, we select all those 4 rows, including this empty separator row, and autofill these values to all other months simply by double-clicking onto the autofill handle. That's the initial data setup that we need for inserting the chart. Before we insert that chart, let's make sure that we have the full range selected. Then we go to the Insert tab, open this bar chart section, and in there we choose the stacked column chart that looks like this. As a quick explanation, in this chart, each stacked bar with its 6 elements represents 1 row in our data. That means this lowest level element in each bar comes from this first column, the second lowest element from the second column, and so on. So the 3 elements at the lower part represent the period in focus data, while the upper 3 elements represent the data for when the period is not in focus. The first crucial adjustment we want to make in this chart is heavily reducing the gap between those individual bars, which already makes this much more pleasant to look at and instantly makes us as the viewer understand which bars probably belong to the same period. As the next step, we're gonna get rid of all the unnecessary chart elements like this title, which we have already covered in the chart area itself, then the chart legend, which we also not need once we have applied our super intuitive and self-explanatory coloring, and finally the horizontal grid lines in order to reduce the general visual complexity. After that, we want to bring in the month's names to the x-axis, with each of these names only displayed once for each group of bars, just like we have already set it up in this column. But before we add this column to the chart data, I recommend to make sure that the axis type is set to text axis. Because even though these month labels are fundamentally set up as dates, we don't want them to be interpreted as dates, as this messes up the whole chart. So make sure that the axis type is set to text axis, and after that you can go to the Chart Design tab, select Data, and then edit these horizontal axis labels by inserting the whole month column. You can perfectly see how these values are now taken at their face value, exactly how we have formatted them. And since in this merged areas in the month column the visible value is only stored in the top cell, we can see that each month's name only appears once and has 3 subsequent empty labels after it. Let's hit enter, and the result speaks for itself. This is the exact axis labeling that we intended to create, with 1 label for each respective group of bars. Let's continue with the coloring of those data elements. And this is the first time that we need to talk in detail about the content and the general concept of this chart, and especially the meaning of each element within these different stacked bars. For each month we have 3 stacked bars. The first one represents the income, the second one the expenses, and the third one the savings. In each of these bars, we now want to show how big is the amount that we have tracked that is still within our budget. Then if the tracked amount is still lower than the budget, how much of that budget is remaining? Or alternatively, in case the tracked amount exceeds the budget, by how much is the budget exceeded? Depending on whether the month is part of the selected period or not, we either gonna make use of the lower three elements in that stacked bar, which will be in color to visually represent the focus, or the upper three elements to make them fade into the background. So you gotta understand that once we link this chart to the actual data, each stacked bar will only display 2 of those 6 elements at the very most. Well, let's start coloring the upper 3 elements in each bar first, as each of these 3 upper elements represents the data of the periods that are not in focus, and for that reason should visually fade into the background. The best colors to achieve that effect is using different shades of gray, all of them being relatively light but still distinguishable from each other. And what's also important with these passive gray tones, we won't visually differentiate between income, expenses or savings, as there would be no additional value. We start with the color for this first element that belongs to the in-budget column in our data. And as a starting point, let's select that lighter gray, but we're gonna adjust it a tiny bit to make it even lighter. Something like this. Then the element representing the remaining budget should be way lighter, so let's jump in here and use the gray tone that we have just customized as a starting point, as this allows us now to click on more colors, and in this advanced color window we can now manually modify the color and see exactly how it differentiates from the starting point color reference. I think this gray tone sets itself apart sufficiently from the in-budget gray tone, so we can click OK and continue with the element that represents the excess of the budget. And again we start by setting it to the in-budget gray, and then customize it to now be darker instead of lighter. That looks good to me, so we confirm. And now we are halfway through this coloring job, you might think, but unfortunately, like the French would say, au contraire. Because coloring the lower 3 elements for the periods in focus will take a bit more effort, but I guarantee the end result will be totally worth it. We start by coloring the lower 3 elements of all stacked bars using the green income color palette. So for the in-budget elements, let's choose this main green tone. Then for the remaining elements, we again choose a super light shade of the color. And eventually for the excess element, we go with a darker green tone. Of course, only the first of these 3 bars in each month actually represents the income, while the second bar always represents the expenses and for that reason should actually be using the red color palette, and the third bar represents the savings and should actually be using the blue color palette. But since in Excel, when setting the color for a data series, we need to decide between either formatting the whole data series at once or instead only single data points, we have now at least set the coloring for all the income bars in each month and only need to individually change the colors for the expenses and savings elements. Let me show you the correctly colored target design for each month using this first month as a blueprint. For the second bar, we set the in-budget element to this main red, then the remaining element to this light red, and the excess element to this darker red. And the same for the savings. First, this main blue for the in-budget element, then this light blue for the remaining amount, and this darker blue for the excess amount. And this is the exact target design that we want to apply for all the months now. So we have to change the colors of 6 individual elements for each month. My personal recommendation for the most efficient procedure here: start coloring the same element in all months at first, as this makes both the selection of the elements and the intuitive choice of the correct color way simpler. So we start with this in-budget expenses element and set it to this main red tone for all the periods. Then we continue with the remaining expenses element and set the color to this light red for all the periods. After that, we finalize the expenses bar by setting the color for the excess element to this darker red for all the periods. And then we repeat that process for the savings bars, starting with the in-budget element, for which we set the color to this main blue, then the remaining element with this light blue, and finally the excess element with this dark blue. Now that has been a lot of manual work, but we have now successfully created the visual foundation for this chart and can now continue with dynamically connecting it to the actual data. For this, let's delete all those dummy data. And just to give you a quick preview of how beautiful this chart will look like when we connect it to real data, let's just enter an in budget and a remaining value for income, expenses and savings. And that gives us this stunning and intuitive visualization of how tracked amounts with some remaining budget will look like. And when we assume that this period is not in focus, then the same data would just appear over here instead, faded into the background through these smooth shades of gray. Okay, let's delete these again and unhide those columns in between to build up the calculations that produce these results for the actual data. As the initial step, we will enter calculations into the columns from month number to delta. And as we're gonna use the autofill functionality a lot, I recommend to first check in one of the columns if the bottom border of the header row is copied over together with the value, which is something we actually don't want to have. If you don't experience that behavior, you can just move on, but in case you face the same issue, this is probably caused by the way that this simple bottom border option we used is implemented. And we can avoid this behavior by removing the border again and then setting it via the advanced border settings. It seems this way it is only defined as the bottom border for this row and not automatically as an upper border for the subsequent row as well. Okay, perfect. As mentioned before, all those columns from the type column to this delta column will be used for generating the input for the calculations in our 6 chart data columns. For that reason, I recommend taking the time to add dynamic name references for each of these columns, as this will make the final formulas in the chart data columns super intuitive and easy to understand. So let's do this and start with the type column, and to differentiate it from the other name references that we have already defined in our main sheets, we add the prefix CC to the name, which stands for chart calculation, and then underscore type. Then the scope to this worksheet only, and finally make the row reference relative by removing the $sign in front of the row number. Next we define the name CC month number, set a scope to this worksheet, and make the row reference relative by removing the $sign. Then we continue with CC in focus for the in focus column, then CC show type for the show type column, and CC show remaining budget CC tracked CC budget and eventually CC delta. Once we are done, every relevant column is accessible in the same row via these dynamic name references, and that will make life a lot easier for the final calculations in those 6 chart data columns. Great! To prepare us for the retrieval of the correct tracked and budget data for each month, we need to extract the month number from the underlying date in the month column. And as you might remember, For this merged cell range, the visible value is always only stored in the top cell. So in that first row for the income, we can just reference the cell in the same row. For the other two rows for expenses and savings though, we need to manually adjust that reference to also refer to the top cell in that merged cell area. After setting this up for the first month, however, we can just select those 4 cells and double-click the autofill handle to automatically generate the month numbers for all the other months. When we move to the next column, the in-focus state of a month will decide about whether that month will be displayed in color or visually move to the background by being displayed in gray. A month should be set to be in focus whenever either the selected period is total year, so every month of that year should be displayed in color, or if the selected period is that specific month. So let's set up the formula for this as if selected period equals total year. Then return a 1 no matter what. Otherwise, the selected period is a specific month and we need to check if it equals the month number. If that is the case, we also gonna return a 1, and only if both these conditions are false, then we're gonna return a 0. Let's add this to the other 2 rows, and then with all 4 cells selected, let's fill that formula to all other months. As the selected period is currently set to be total year, this value is 1 for every month. When we change the selected period to a specific month, however, only that month is still set to 1, while all the other months now display a 0. So later in our chart data columns, we can use this in-focus value as a switch to either display our data in the first 3 columns or the last 3 columns. The next column, that is called Show Type, will also act as a switch in the chart data column calculations to either display or completely hide the data of any of the 3 types. We want to make the visibility of each type controllable via checkboxes. And to set up these checkboxes, let's create some labels first up here that say Show Income, Show Expenses, and Show Savings. We format the text to be bold and a bit smaller. And we're gonna add a Boolean value like true for each of them, also with a slightly reduced font size. And all we need to do now in order to convert these Boolean values up there into a switch for each data row that is related to the respective type is starting the formula with 1 times that respective Boolean value. Here the relevant Boolean value is the Show Income one. We also make sure that the reference is an absolute reference with $signs. And that's it. We only need to create a similar formula for the other 2 types. So let's enter 1 times this Show Expenses Boolean value as an absolute reference. And finally for the savings type, 1 times the Show Savings Boolean value as an absolute reference. And once this is set up for the first month, we can again just select those 4 cells and push this formula to all the other months. And now when we set one of these Boolean values to false, the show type value for that type is set to 0 for all the months. To now bring in some actual checkboxes to directly control those Boolean values up there, let's go to the Developer tab, which you can enable in the Excel options in case it is not visible. And in there we can click on Insert, and in the Form Control section select the checkbox element, which we then insert right here. Let's change the label to Income, and then right-click on it and open the Format Control window, which now allows us to connect this checkbox to this Boolean value. When we hit Enter, the Boolean value is instantly dependent on the checkbox state, which means we now have full control over the income rows in that Show Type column. Let's duplicate that checkbox twice to create an Expenses checkbox that controls the Show Expenses Boolean value, and similarly the Savings checkbox to control the show savings Boolean value. Perfect. Let's position these checkboxes right above the show type column for now. And then we can continue with the show remaining budget column. The value in this column will also serve as a switch, this time to either hide or display the chart data columns for the remaining budget. For this, let's create another Boolean value up there that has the label show remaining budget that we initially set to true. And as this switch will not make any difference between the individual types or months and is the same for all the data rows, we can just enter 1 times that Boolean value, make it an absolute reference, then autofill it to the other 2 types, and eventually, with these 4 cells selected, push it to all the other months. And to also make that switch controllable via a checkbox, we duplicate one of the existing checkboxes, change the label to budget, and link it to the respective Boolean value. Perfect! Now the state of the checkbox is instantly available in every data row. To retrieve the tracked and budget data per type for each individual month, we're gonna take some inspiration from the approach that we have used in this hidden pre-calculation section of the budget dashboard. Let's first take a look at the formula that we have used to calculate the tracked values for the category and total items. In here, we have differentiated between 4 possible cases, all of which use a different combination of conditional array filters applied to the columns of this tracking table. That way we were able to sum up only the relevant amounts. In this nested if statement, we first checked if the respective item is a total or category item, and then in the second level if statement, if the selected period is total year or alternatively a specific month. For the tracked value in our tracked versus budget chart now, we are only interested in the total amounts for each type, which directs our focus to these 2 upper cases. And we are not interested in the amount for the total year, but instead want to calculate the tracked amount for each respective month. That means the second case formula right here is the closest to what we need for the tracked values in our chart data. We only need to adjust some of the filter values. So let's copy this over, insert it into this first cell of that column, and then we go through the different parts of that formula step by step. In here, we also want to build the sum over the values in the amount column of the tracking table, so we leave that first part as is. Then for filtering down to the correct type, we now want to do this based on the type that we have defined in the type column here. Then, as we are interested in the months of the selected year, we can leave the next part as is as well, and only need to adjust this final month filtering to not be based on the selected period, but instead be based on the respective month number available in each row as CC month number. And that's it. When we add this formula to the expenses and savings rows, you see the amounts automatically adjust as each of them is filtered down to the relevant type of each row. And in the same way, when we now select these 4 cells and push that formula to all the other months, the amounts are filtered down to the respective month numbers and accurately represent the total tracked amounts per type and month. For retrieving the budget values per type and month, let's also take a look at what we have done for retrieving these values in the pre-calculation section of the dashboard worksheet. In the main formula here, we used the index function to return a value from a multi-row and multi-column array defined as the columns E to EM in the budget planning sheet. So basically all these columns. To identify the exact cell in that array from which we want to return the value, we needed to provide a row and column number. For the row number, we have provided the row ID, which basically represents all the row numbers of the relevant header, category, and total items in the budget planning sheet. For our chart now, we are only interested in the total items, so here we could easily just provide either the income total row, the expenses total row, or the savings total row. And to identify the correct column number, what we have done in this formula was using the match function to look up either the selected year number, if the selected period is total year, or otherwise a composed date with the selected year and selected period, since these month headers have full dates as their underlying values. The lookup row is E9 to EM9, and we want to find an exact match. Now, when we think about our chart, we are only interested in looking up the column number of each respective month, for which we have the month number available, and thus can dynamically compose the respective full date that is required. That means in this match statement, we could now directly use a composed date like this as the lookup value and can basically throw out this whole if statement part before. So let's copy over this formula into the first cell of that budget column. Then we bring this all into the same line. And now for the row number argument, we can directly reference the total row number of the respective type. So the income total row for this first row. And then to identify the correct column, we can remove the if statement and directly use the composed date as lookup value to look up the column of the relevant month. In that composed date, we keep the selected year, but then for the month argument, we provide the respective month number representing the month in each row. When we hit enter, this returns the total income budget value for January, which can be confirmed after taking a quick look at the budget planning sheet. When we add this formula to the rows for expenses and savings, the value stays the same as we haven't adjusted the name reference in the row argument. To get the expenses total budget, we need to change this to expenses total row. And for the savings total budget, we need to change this to savings total row. And that is it. We can just select those 4 cells, and with a double click onto the autofill handle, the formulas are successfully pushed to all the other rows and now return the total income, expenses, and savings budget amount in each individual month. That is amazing and allows us to now calculate the delta between these two values as CC budget minus CC tracked. Let's push this formula to all the data rows. And as a final step, let's set these columns to have the same accounting number format with 0 decimal places. And also jump over to the budget dashboard worksheet to hide those pre-calculation columns again. Wonderful! We are now well prepared to build up the calculations in our 6 chart data columns based on all these available input values. So let's get right into it. In the In Budget column, we basically want to display the tracked amount, but with the limitation that this value can only get as high as the budgeted amount. And whenever the budget is exceeded, the excess amount then goes into the excess column. So to display the tracked amount with the budget amount as the upper limit, we can simply return the minimum of CC tracked and CC budget. Because in case the tracked amount is still below the budget, then this tracked amount is returned, and in case the tracked amount exceeds the budget, then the budget amount is returned as the upper limit. So you can see for the total income in January, the tracked value exceeds the budget, and for that reason the returned value is limited to the budget amount, while for the expenses, for example, the tracked value is still below the budget amount, and thus the tracked value itself is returned. And eventually, for the savings, the tracked value exceeds the budget again, and thus the returned value is limited to the budget amount. Whenever the tracked value is below the budget amount, which means the delta value is positive, then we want to return the remaining delta in this remaining column. So let's set up an if statement that checks if CC delta is greater than 0, like it is the case for the expenses in January, for example. And if that's true, then we want to return that CC delta value as the remaining budget amount. And otherwise, we simply set it to 0. As you see, this produces a 0 for both the income and savings, as there is no remaining budget here. But for the expenses, we have a remaining budget amount of 100 that is now also visible here in the chart in this light red color. In a similar way, we want to return the delta in the excess column whenever the tracked value exceeds the budget amount. That means if CC delta is negative, so smaller than 0, we want to return the absolute value of that CC delta as the excess amount. And otherwise 0. This gives us an excess value of 200 for the income and 300 for the savings, which are instantly visible in these darker shades of their respective colors in the chart. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think this is just a beautiful visualization of so many information at once. And if our goal would be a static, non-interactive chart, we could now just push these formulas to all the other data rows and call it a day, as we have the tracked and budgeted values beautifully visualized for every single type in every month of the selected year. But since we want to also build in our dynamic switch values to make both the coloring dynamic based on the selected period and also control the visibility of the individual chart elements through our checkboxes, let's go one step back and make our existing formulas dependent on these values called InFocus, ShowType, and ShowRemainingBudget. Let's quickly talk about the desired effect we want each of these switches to have. We want all of those first 3 column values only be displayed if InFocus in that respective row equals 1. Otherwise, we want all the values in the first 3 columns to be 0. So all we need to do is multiplying all 3 formulas by this InFocus value. In a similar way, we want all column values only be displayed if ShowType in that respective row equals 1. Otherwise, we want all the values in all columns of that row to be 0. So again, we need to multiply all these formulas by this ShowType as well. And finally, we want the remaining column value only be displayed in case ShowRemainingBudget in that respective row equals 1. Otherwise, we want that remaining value to be 0 in order to hide the budget. So only for the remaining column formula, we're gonna add in the ShowRemainingBudget value as a third factor in front of the existing formula. Let's start by multiplying the InBudget formula by CC_InFocus and CC_ShowType to only display the resulting value in case both these switch values are set to 1. Then we update the other 2 rows with this adjusted formula. Let's copy those 2 factors to also add them into the formula of the remaining column. But here we extend that by adding CC_ShowRemainingBudget as a third factor that also needs to be set to 1 in order to show that value. Then we add that updated formula to the other 2 rows as well. And finally, let's add this initial 2 factors CC_InFocus and CC_ShowType to the excess calculation as well. And update the other 2 rows. Now we can push these upgraded formulas to all the other periods and directly test the functionality of those checkboxes to hide and display the expenses, savings, or income for each month. or generally hiding all the remaining budget values to put the focus on the tracked amounts only. That works perfectly. And now, as the final step to also visualize the periods not in focus, let's just copy over these three formulas from the first row and then simply negate the CC in focus value in all these formulas by putting it into a not function. That means whenever a period is not part of the selected period and thus not in focus, this will now be true. Right now, this whole expression returns 0 for all the rows in all the months, as the selected period is total year, and for that reason all the periods are in focus. But once we jump over to the Budget Dashboard worksheet and select a specific month in that period dropdown, only that specific month has its values returned in the Period in Focus columns and is displayed in color, while the values of all the other months are now displayed in the Period Not in Focus columns, and for that reason are visualized in these shades of gray. That is pure Excel chart magic. And of course, all these formulas still work perfectly hand in hand with those checkboxes, and we can hide and display elements just like before. Great! As this chart is now fully set up, let's move it over to the Budget Dashboard worksheet and make it fit into this Prepared Chart section. For that, let's first right-click on it and open the Format Chart Area section on the right in order to set the fill to no fill and the border to no line. Then we reduce the size and position it somewhere inside this chart section. For these Y-axis labels, I recommend to slightly reduce the font size to something like 7 and set the font color to a darker gray. And for these X-axis labels, we apply the same font size and color, but also make them bold. After that, we just play around with the position and size of that chart until we are fully satisfied. And then we can do the first test of the interplay between this period dropdown and the dynamic chart coloring. Seems like it works perfectly. With the total year selected, all the periods are visualized in color, while for the current month, which is March, only the March values are colorized. And the same when we switch to any other month. Amazing! The only components we still need to bring in here are the checkboxes. So let's jump back to the calculation sheet select all of them, then cut them here and paste them over here. Unfortunately, the link to the underlying Boolean value in the calculation sheet somehow gets messed up when moving them to another sheet. We can easily see that by checking and unchecking them with no impact on our chart at all. We can figure out what the problem is when we right-click on one of these checkboxes and open the Format Control window. As you see, the cell link is still E49, but it doesn't show any worksheet specification. So now this checkbox is just linked to the cell E49 on this dashboard worksheet, which obviously makes no sense at all. We need to fix this for all the 4 checkboxes by manually redefining the link to now reference the correct cell in the calculations worksheet again. Same for the expenses checkbox. the Savings checkbox, and the Budget checkbox. And with this adjustment, we gain back the control over the visibility of the chart elements through these checkboxes. As the final step to finish this whole chart section, let's move these checkboxes close to the chart into the top right corner of the chart section. And to visually separate them from the rest of the chart, let's insert a normal rectangle for which we're going to remove the fill and set a line to have a mid-light gray color and a width of 0.5. Then we adjust the size of the rectangle and also its position until we are fully satisfied. And after that, let's select all those 4 checkbox elements, set them to a standardized height and width, and move them into the rectangle, making sure that all of them fit in there. Then I recommend to open the selection pane to make the selection of those 3 a bit easier. In order to align them to the left and distribute them vertically. Maybe we should move them a little bit more to the left. And finally, let's select the Budget checkbox and the Income checkbox to align them to the top. And at that point, we have completed this whole Tracked versus Budget chart section. With these checkboxes placed that close to the actual chart, hiding and displaying the individual components becomes an even more intuitive experience and allows us to view the tracked and budget data over time from multiple angles and at different degrees of visual complexity. In addition, when going through the individual months of the selected year, this chart beautifully highlights the relevant insights for that month only and enables us to better understand how the respective month's data can be compared within the bigger context.